Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is session 5, Invoicing Resources. This is our Implementing Acquisitions in Alma series. I'm Jenny Drager. I'm a training services consultant, and with me is Yala Ariel Yol, and she's a very familiar name and face in our support department, technical support senior analyst. We are using WebEx. That is why you are muted. I'm getting a message that someone cannot hear, and Yala, can you answer to everyone that there is indeed audio, and if anyone can't hear, that they should just leave and come back into WebEx?
Absolutely.
Thank you. And that's what we get. That's sometimes, sometimes the audio is a little off, and I've had even audio drop in the middle of a session, and I'll always confirm that other people can hear, but just exit and come back. Remember, we're recording this meeting. It'll be made available to you. And any questions, please send any questions to all panelists. That way Yala sees them and I see them, and that's how I make my Q&A docs. And I got the Q&A for last week up, and I corrected the one from 2 weeks ago where I forgot that one question. So those are all available on the series dashboard for you. Okay, so we're in week 5 of 6 today. We're talking about invoicing resources. And remember, everything I've been doing throughout this session, I've been doing it very manually in Alma, and next week we're going to really talking about automating this whole process and making it easier. I do it manually to illustrate how Alma works, what the pieces are in Alma that need to come together. But there are definitely steps you can take to minimize your data entry manually. So this is our agenda. We're going to start with, the workflow and basics like we always do. And then get into actually doing some invoicing, different, our one-time orders, our continuous orders, the ability to invoice from a file upload, and that's a manual upload. And then we'll talk about payments and credits, entering those into Alma, and then also being able to monitor ledgers and funds. So this is our workflow, and we're at the final step here. We've gone through everything else, and we're at the invoicing phase. One question that I get from customers they might be resistant to doing all the work and all, related to acquisitions. Do I have to invoice? Do I really have to do it? The answer is yes. What it does is that closes the loop on the transaction cycle. It tracks the actual payment for resources. It updates funds in your ledger, so you know how much you have left, to spend. That fiscal year rollover is affected, because for your continuous orders, when you do a rollover, you can go on last year's payment. So you can look at last year's invoice instead of last year's PO line to update the PO line for the new year to keep everything more accurate. And then also cost per use calculations. So in analytics, those cost per use calculations rely on those expenditures that's the expenditure in the fund is related to invoicing. So yes, you do need to take this last step. Now, there are some workflow considerations for you to put to think about. Do you have an invoice review and or approval process? You can set up Alma to set PO lines into review, whether it's from a certain vendor or over a certain price threshold, or a combination of settings that can do that for you. Again, don't add a step if you don't need it, because if you do put an invoice into a manual review and or approval process, that takes a staff member to go in and go ahead and click, that approve. It's another step. So if you need it, do it. But if you don't, let it go. Do any of your vendors that you work with offer invoicing via EDI? If you have that relationship with a vendor or had that in the past, that's a great way to start with automating the processes. Another workflow to consider, do you or can you export invoices from Alma to an ERP? What that does is that is your campus business system, and that's who really might cut the check, who might really pay the bills. And so if a number of our customers do this, and so the communication, instead of sending something over to that office to say, cut the bill, cut the check, Alma can send that information into those systems. And we have a lot of documentation about that. And maybe if you don't want to do that now, maybe in the future, maybe you say, let's do that with the next fiscal year, or, let's get going on Alma acquisitions. And then once we're more comfortable, we'll approach the business office with that possibility. And then hand in hand with, if you export invoices over to the business office, do you receive payment confirmation from your business office? If you do, Alma can ingest that data, or if you really want to, you could manually enter that data into Alma, and then you would have all the information you need about payments should something come up. Our acquisition roles and user terminology. So the roles that are related to, and I'm just going to go right into the documentation here. I'm going to click on here because I love pushing you to the doc. So if I come in here into the doc, remember this looks a little different because I'm logged into this platform here. And so there is an invoice manager, there's an invoice operator, and there's invoice operator extended. So these are the people that are allowed to create, edit invoices. Only the invoice operator extended can delete invoices. And remember, it goes hand in hand with the invoice operator role. There are a few other roles related to invoicing. And let me just go down this page a little more. Come on. And they're view only roles though. So if you are like a purchasing operator, purchasing manager, it's viewing invoices. But to actually create them is the invoice manager, invoice operator, and then to be able to delete is invoice operator extended. In here. So we could create invoices in Alma different ways. We could enter the invoice details manually. I'm going to show you that. We're going to invoice from a purchase order, so that uses details from the PO. I'll show you that as well. You can manually import a file, whether it's in Excel or via EDI, electronic data interchange, using that standard. Or you could automatically import invoices via EDI, and that's something we'll cover next week when we talk about integrations. So when we go to invoice our one-time orders, what you do from the acquisitions menu, you go to receiving and invoicing, create invoice, and then you have these options: manually, from a PO, from a file. I mentioned when we were receiving our materials, if in your library the same person receives and create invoices, you may choose to change this workflow a little bit and have that person create the invoice and receive off of that. And I'm going to try to do that and not forget to click that handle receiving button, which I often forget to click. And that's exactly what I want to show you, how that works in Alma. So you go into the menu, say I want to create an invoice, choose the way you're going to create it. Now on this main page, there are a couple of other sections, one regarding additional charges. So if you check this little box that says use pro rata, these fields pull up here. So it's a shipment amount, insurance amount, overhead and discount amount. And these, if you set this up here using pro rata, these values will be distributed across the invoice lines, and they'd be considered, part of the cost of the material. If you do not select this use pro rata box, then these fields do not show up, and these additional charges are displayed as individual invoice lines. We're going to see that when we get in there. A couple more things on the summary tab I'm trying to draw your attention to is VAT or taxes, so value added tax. If your library happens to pay, you're in a state or country where you do pay tax on these materials, that is set up here. It's set up according to your vendor, whether they're liable for VAT or not, whether the VAT type is inclusive or exclusive. So is the price you pay, already built into the price, or do you have to submit the tax to an agency yourself? And so I have a link into the documentation regarding sales tax or value added tax. And then the bottom of the summary tab, the last section I want to draw your attention to is this payment information section. And so by default, this prepaid box will not be checked, and then these fields will not show. So the prepaid checks box is available if payment method is not accounting department. So we're going to see on the PO line or on the invoice that who pays this bill. And if accounting department is checked, you cannot make this prepaid, because Alma's expecting to send this to the accounting department. If the payment method is not accounting department, you have the option to mark this as prepaid. And if you do mark an invoice as prepaid, let's say you use a credit card or something, and so you settle that later. Sorry about that. My mouse is getting a little crazy. So if you do mark that invoice as prepaid, the invoices are not sent to the ERP. They do not go through that process, and the status goes to immediately closed. So if you choose the manual invoice creation, we add an invoice line, enter the PO line number. Let's go ahead and do that now. Here, back into Alma. I'm going to go to acquisitions, create invoice. What am I set at? Oh, I want to get up to 125, a little bigger here. There we go. Acquisitions, receiving and invoicing, create invoice. So I'm going to create my first one manually. So that means I need a 2022-0421-1. Here's my invoice number. We'll say the invoice is today. Who's my vendor? EKSN. There we go. There's my code. So, and if I didn't know that, I could always click on this little box and search from the list. Now, on an invoice, you only have to put the vendor in. You can choose a vendor account, but it's completely optional. So that would just be up to you if you want to track that. And you know what? I don't know the total amount of my invoices, so I'm going to have to settle this up later. So in here, if you had a printed invoice in front of you, you would put that value here, and then the lines should add up to this. Now, I'm going to have to make some adjustments because I didn't track what my individual lines cost. Here's that option to use pro rata. So if you have those additional charges and you want to spread them across the line items, that's where you do that. I'm going to show you them as individual lines in this scenario. And here's the tax section and then prepaid. So my payment method is accounting department. So I'm saying the accounting department actually cuts the checks, does the payment for these materials. And you'll see I can't even check the prepaid box because of that accounting department. If this does get changed to something else, then I have this box and I can put that information in there. So let me change this back to accounting department because that's what I want to do. I've got my basic information here, save and create invoice lines. So my out of the box, generally your system, this is how it's set up. It will create these 4 lines, which are the same lines that we saw in the pro rata section. So by default, this is how your environment is set up. You can configure these to not create all of them, not create any of them. You could always add them manually later if you need them, however you want to work it. There's no harm in leaving them on here and not having anything in the lines, but some people just don't like that. And so you definitely have configuration options to make those changes in your environment. So if I add an invoice line, And my first PO line, and I've got it, 84.58. Now the price on here was going to be $37. I'll say, yep, that's correct. My reporting codes look good. My fund looks good. Okay. Add. And I've got another one, 80.60. Okay, that one is going to be $28. Oh, that reporting code wasn't correct. I could always change my fund. I could change my value. Add. And let's say if you don't have the PO line numbers, let me just double check what title that is. 15 minutes of play. So you can always come in here and search. And here it is. So what it did was it took the vendor and brought this over here. So this limited down to lines by the vendor, but you could see I could come in here and do a title, ISBN, all sorts of different options. This is the title I want. Again, oh, let's say this ended up being $21. So that changed, that updated. Okay, so we added our 3 lines. If I needed to edit any of these, maybe I had a shipping charge. $5. And since I have a charge, I do need to select a fund. And I'm gonna grab a fund here. And save. So I've got all my lines done. Everything looks correct. Now I know if I try to save and continue, I'm going to get an error because this and this do not match. So let me show you it. So this is the hard error that we have to correct. This value and this value don't match. But this other warning message that comes up, what it's telling me is the invoice owner is the institution and all the associated PO lines are owned by a single library. And so you can change the invoice owner if you wish. This is a soft block and you can disable this warning if you just want to leave everything at the institution. It's more informational. So let me just correct this, $91. I did have to correct that. And if I click save and continue, it's that same message. Okay. Now, if that vendor, if that invoice had gone into an approval status, it would be here on the waiting for approval invoices. My vendor that I didn't have too much money, I didn't have a vendor that threw it into that approval process, so we're all good. So I do want to show you creating an invoice from a PO, and I don't want to forget to click this, handle receiving. So this is helpful if the box that came in of materials, is either equal to the PO or pretty darn close to the PO. Maybe you got 8 out of 10 things, so you create the line, you create the invoice from the PO and then just delete those 2 that didn't come in. Can save you some time. So my PO is, let me get my number here, 140313. And Alma's, it's a little more forgiving in this field where I didn't have to have the PO dash. So what does that do? I had 3 lines on this PO. Here they all are. If one of them wasn't in the shipment, I could just click delete and get rid of it. Excuse me. But I'm going to say, okay, these are all here. Let's say I look at the prices. And so at this point, I'm just verifying, is the price correct? Yes, yes, yes. Funds correct. If I needed to make any changes, I could. And what you'll notice back here by doing this, the PO number becomes the invoice number. So you might have to update that. match whatever's in front of you. Here's the date, here's the totals, everything is done. And then you click here and save and go to receiving. And then this just brings you to the receiving workbench, and I could quickly keep in department, copy cataloging, receive. So I've done both of those steps. I've created my invoice and I've done my receiving all in one step. Okay, oops, why am I at the beginning of my PowerPoint? Let's get back down to where we wanted to go. Boop, boop, boop. Okay, we talked about the selection, entering the PO line number or search. That was creating the the invoice manually, reviewing, updating. You know, you want to verify that price. You want to verify any reporting codes, funds. Or if you didn't put reporting codes in the PO line, you could always do it here. Just the ability to edit the PO lines as needed. Okay, so this slide is talking about where to go and change these options if you don't like these lines being created automatically. So, like I said, by default, typically this is how your environments are configured. So option to configure does not show up unless the customer parameter, you have to change this invoice underscore split underscore add additional charges to enabled. And the link on how to do that is right here. This will take you to the documentation. And then once that is enabled, then you have the ability to configure those lines. There are some checks an invoice goes through, just like a PO line. The validation is, do those prices match? Is there a price? Is there a vendor? You know, those required pieces of information. And there are hard errors that have to be corrected before an invoice can move on to the next step. You can have, and remember, if Alma can't do this itself, Alma will throw an invoice into review. But you could have a manual review option. You know, you just set the qualifiers up against review rules. But it does require staff to open it up and review the invoice before proceeding to the next step. You might have approval workflow, maybe if something's over a certain dollar amount or from specific vendors. So you can configure approval rules, which may put the invoice into an approval status. Again, requires a staff member to approve an invoice before proceeding to the next step. Invoicing. Now let's talk about invoicing continuous orders, subscriptions, and standing orders. It's pretty much the same workflow. You can create the invoice manually from a PO, from a file, same information on the summary tab. There is a difference for your continuous subscription orders on the invoice line details. Alma wants some data either in this field or this field. And the subscription date range, you have to use the date picker to get data in here. This additional information field is a free text field. So there's a line here, PO line subscription dates range. This data that shows here came from the PO line, but it is not required content on the PO line. So if you fill it in, it shows up here on the invoice line. But if you didn't fill it in, that's okay. You could always just, because it's easy to replicate that here, or you could just put in a message here in the additional information field. But Alma's going to want one of those filled in to approve a subscription invoice line. So this is just talking about how that data got there. Or if you are creating invoices from a file import, either Excel or EDI, you want to make sure that required data is in the file, because if it's not, then you get to go in and update every single invoice line. And the whole point of loading it from an import is so you don't have to do that. let's go ahead and do that. Acquisitions, create invoice, and this is going to be, I could do this from a PO also, so I have my PO number. I don't always remember to get that. PO number is 135314. And okay, this one might go into review because the vendor. I think that's what I saw in this environment. So hold it in. Maybe I need to update this invoice number. Want all those dashes in there, but I guess it doesn't matter. There we go. Prices look good. Okay, so this is going to throw this into approval, but that's fine. It's not the best. Everything over 0. So they're saying, you know, if it's ProQuest, put it into a review file. So I've created my invoice. I click save and continue. And here it is. It's sitting here in the, oh, that's going to waiting for payment, not waiting for approval. Hold on. Okay, maybe that one didn't go. Let's see. We'll find out. We'll find out. So let me go back to that invoice. Invoice. 421. Okay, it did go to, oh, the first one went in approval, but that one went to waiting for payment. Okay, I didn't expect that to happen. And my invoice line, okay. Now, it didn't give me any, usually I get stopped here. So I don't know why that one didn't do that. Let's do this one more time because that should have given me that error. And it did before. Okay, let's try this one more time. Acquisitions, create invoice. We're going to do do I have a PO link? I don't. I do. From a PO. Next. 135 135 315. Save. Edit. Oh, this one was a standing order, not a continuous subscription. With a standing order, this data is not required. But with the continuous order, and I don't know why, because yesterday it stopped me and I had to fill that information in. With a standing order, this subscription date range is not required though. And there we go. The next slide is talking about another box that will appear on an invoice line is check subscription date overlap. And if it's checked, you just uncheck it. It doesn't, the functionality of it is editing prior purchase orders. It doesn't have anything to do with your active invoice. I put a link in here into more information about that checkbox. With standing orders, this data is not required. Where with the continuous subscription, they are. Talked about the ability to upload via a file. You can invoice via a file upload. So you would just choose from file, and then you have 2 different file options, either EDI or Excel. You just need to identify the vendor, select the file type, upload the file, and run the job. And then Alma will ingest that. There is an option here to download that Excel example, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. There's also another place that invoice Excel file example from the documentation. So if once you run the job, it won't take, depending how big the invoice is, you go to the running tab. Once it's done, you can always click on the report and see what the output is. If there were any errors, how many invoices were created. Let's go back into Alma here. So if I go to acquisitions, create invoice, and I choose this from a file, you could still receive off of this, that's no problem. But I want to show you this Excel example. I pulled this down last night too. Now you're not going to get this. You would have to build this if a vendor doesn't have EDI. And we've got quite a bit of information in here, that line type, total amount, the PO lines, currency, vendor, payment method, title, etc. So if your vendor isn't EDI, doesn't have EDI capabilities, you can use this template to build an Excel file to ingest those invoices. If a vendor can supply you with an EDI file, it's much easier because you're just following that standard. And then, like, I ran this job yesterday, I ran it this morning. And if I go look at the report, nothing failed. And I can see I created one purchase order with these lines. So the report gives you everything you need. Next topic is payments and credits. So if an invoice has been approved and it's moved on to the payment stage, there are 3 potential invoice statuses. So this is after any approvals. One is ready to be paid. And so that is the status if the invoice is approved and it's ready to be sent to the ERP, the business office. And what will happen is a job will run every night on your environment to push that data. It'll push it to the FTP server, and the business office will go pull it off of the ERP system will go pull it off of the FTP server and load it. So that is communication from Alma to the ERP. Now, my environment that I'm working with, it's set to skip this. So mine is configured to skip this and go straight to waiting for payment. And so when an invoice is in the waiting for payment status, it's available, and it's what Alma thinks it's been approved and sent to the ERP or skipped, like we do that. And it's waiting for information back from the ERP into Alma, like the vendor or the voucher number. And so whether that is sent automatically or whether you key that information in, that's completely up to you. Or the last potential invoice status is closed. So if you don't use an ERP, you mark something prepaid, it goes immediately to closed. You have everything you need, and not expecting any more data relating to this invoice. If I come back here into Alma, and I can see my waiting for payment. So we have one sitting here. If I come in here and edit this, What Alma's looking for is data in here. So I could put in a, whatever, let's say that's a voucher number. I don't have to change that. I just enter in the data in the voucher number. And I click save and continue, ignore that little message, and it goes away from the waiting for payment. All I had to do, something in there, and it'll change that status. Let me show you the status. You don't have to worry about changing that status from not paid to paid. You put the data in there, that payment status will get toggled. I don't know how many people would do that if the ERP wasn't doing it, but I'd just like to show you how that works. So this is where you go to configure some of these settings. Are you integrating with an ERP system? So if you come in here to config acquisitions, general, other settings, there's a line invoice _ skip _ ERP. If you say you're skipping the ERP, you set this to true, Alma's not sending the invoice. That's what my environment is set as. False would be Alma is sending an invoice to the ERP, so anything that is not marked prepaid would be bundled up in that file and run on the job and put on the FTP server. And then do you receive notification from an invoice that was paid? If you do, yes. And you would set, handle _ invoice _ payment to true. Or if you don't want to do that and just want the invoice to close and you're done as soon as you approve it, just set that to false. So that's where you make those changes in your environment. This is just talking about if you are waiting, handle _ invoice _ payment. If that is set to true, this is almost waiting for data in this field. And I did put a link into the developer network about the integration for the finance. So plenty of our customers do this. Now, if you happen to get a credit from a vendor for material, you go ahead and create the invoice manually. On the summary tab, select the vendor who issued the credit, enter the total amount as a negative, and then here on the invoice line, you would also enter the value of the credit with the minus sign in front of the price and choose the fund where that money is going to go back, where that money will be applied. And that'll put that money back in that fund so that you have that money to spend and you have the record of it at Alma. So our last topic is monitoring ledgers and funds. So remember, if we go look at our ledgers right now, the PO line creates an encumbrance in one or more funds, depends if it's split or not. And then the invoice creates two transactions. It creates the disencumbrance of that original encumbered amount, and it does an expenditure. So the disencumbrance will be the same value, the same amount as the encumbrance and in the same fund as the encumbrance, but the expenditure, it may be in a different fund or funds. It might get split. It may be a completely different amount. And I also want to mention, if we go into Alma and we're looking at funds and ledgers, remember everything in Alma is up to the minute and down to the penny. Where if we go look in analytics, remember analytics is yesterday's data. Every night the data is pulled from Alma and sent to analytics. And it goes through something called the ETL, extract, transform, and load process. So if I go into analytics, I'm not going to see the stuff I did today. I'm going to see the stuff from yesterday will be the most recent, whenever this data pull was done. So if you are running acquisitions reports about, values, funds, make sure you run them in the morning. Run them at 5, 6 in the morning, not at 10 at night. Because at 10 at night, you're going to be, oops, I don't want to do that. I don't want 2 days ago. I want yesterday. So if I go into, I think I was using a lot of humanities. I think it was this one, edit. And we could see my transactions. Let's look at 84.73. So here's the initial PO line. And then when we created the invoice, it disencumbered that original amount and expended based on the invoice. So what you see is to the minute, to the penny. Analytics is yesterday. And you could do some filtering. We'll be able to track that information. Yala, I'm going to pull up the chat. Were there any questions we need to back and look at?
I didn't notice.
Okay. Oh, I've gotten some things sent privately to me. Okay. I didn't send them to everyone. That's why you didn't see them. Here's a question. RE payment information. I've noticed that you can check prepaid, enter information in the fields, and then uncheck prepaid. The information you entered will remain despite the box being unchecked. Ooh, I've never tried that. So what he's saying is I can come in here, I can create an invoice manually, and let's put 2022-04-21-4. I've never tried that. Book cents, dollars. So he said I changed this to credit card. I can do this prepaid. And uncheck this. Now I'm not seeing, no, maybe it's after you got in here a little further and you came back to summary. So my question is for this is, if you uncheck prepaid, does the invoice close as if prepaid was checked or not? And that's what I'd have to test. And open up a support case because let's see, if it's unchecked, I'd have to do some testing on that, and I can. I just want to see what the behavior is. I can understand that you can check and uncheck it because you're not done. But if that's credit card and unchecked, is it going to close the invoice or is it going to leave it open? And I can test that when we get done. Okay, I have a question also sent to me privately. Where are the recordings of these sessions? I'm going to put that in the chat. This is where the recordings are, the PowerPoints are, the Q&A docs are. So I make a Q&A doc of questions that come up after each session. So I just put the link in the chat. There was a question about where to change the config to remove those lines from the invoice. That's in the PowerPoint, and you saw that. Great. Here's another question. And remember, all these questions that come in, I will be putting them in the Q&A doc, so you can read them and see my responses, and they'll be here available for you, okay? That's why I take this chat and I create the Q&A doc. So this next question says, likely an analytics question, but if I order e-resources via consortium and I'm invoiced and are invoiced by the consortium for, say, ProQuest products, and the sushi counter reports are under ProQuest. I've been having counter discussions this morning with a colleague, so that's why I'm laughing. How do I get cost per use if the invoice info is under the consortium and usage stats are under the product vendor? Okay, this is getting a little bit in the weeds, but the stats and the Alma vendor, does not relate to the counter stats. It's, if you look at the counter report, let's see, counter cost per use. So we're getting a little bit in the weeds. And I want to talk, Yoel has a really good, so I've been in here today. So if you look at, okay, this example, I like this example because there's an example of a counter report in here. And the qualifier in counter is the item platform, because you might pay ProQuest or EBSCO for something that, you know, that's just the payment person. And so the counter stats are really from the platform related to that portfolio, if you will, and how many people accessed this title through Project Muse versus Silverchair. So the question was, if I order e-resources via consortium and are invoiced by the consortium for, say, ProQuest products, and the sushi counter reports are under ProQuest, how do I get cost per use if the info is under consortium and user stats are under product vendor? So the Alma vendor does not matter. The usage stats are calculated. And if you look at these things that Yoel is writing, counter is looking at this item platform. And then it has the price information. Here's the electronic portfolio editor. And the price is coming from a purchase order line, or no, the invoice. This is a really good article. I'm going to put this in the chat also. And I've been combing through this with, like I said, another colleague. So Alma vendor is not part of the equation. Now, you do need a counter report for your institution as opposed to the whole consortium. So if it's the counter report is generated for your institution, you just load that in. When Yoel explained that to me, it blew my mind that the Alma vendor really isn't part of the equation. Anything else for me? Anything else for me? As always, I share resources, and I'm always pushing you to the documentation. Sometimes we call it the CKC for Customer Knowledge Center, the Knowledge Center. We have a LibGuide. Remember, all of our documentation is also indexed in Google. Okay. Oh, here's a follow-up about that question. I was confused. The invoice is under the consortium, so cost would be there, but usage was under vendor. Guessing you can use analytics and reference the PO line regardless of vendor to merge those two vendors. And double check Yoel's. I'll look for one that specifically, I'm going to look for something from him because he kind of is our guru on that, specifically about the situation you're explaining, and I'll put it in the Q&A. So I'm glad you wrote that up. Here's the link to the series that I just shared in the chat. And next week, we're going to be talking about this whole automating this whole process. Maybe you're going to use embedded order data. Maybe you're going to use EDI, the finance integration, and then monitoring jobs. Okay, so I'm going to grab, so don't forget, grabbing the chat. Okay, everyone, thank you for your time today, and we'll see you next week to wrap up this series. Have a good rest of your day.